Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to our webinar on radionuclide production. Before we actually start on our second session, I would like to refer to the polling that came in at the end of the session earlier. And thank you, everybody, for those of you who did respond. So the first question was, the ANSTO opal reactor is valued for money to the Australian taxpayer because it overcomes barriers experienced internationally. 76.5% of the respondents agree and 23.5% disagree. The second question, the increased waste footprint of export is offset by benefits and waste volume of reduction technology. 80% agree and 20% of the respondents disagree. So thank you very much for engaging in our first session. The second session is, before I actually commence that, I would like to reintroduce our panel members for those of you who weren't able to join us at 9 o'clock. So around the panel we have Paterson, the CEO of ANSTO, Associate Professor Barry Ellison, the Director of Nuclear Medicine, Illawarra Shoalhaven Area Health Service, Professor Dale Bailey, President of the Australian and New Zealand Society of Nuclear Medicine and Medical Physicist at Royal North Shore Hospital, Dr. Margaret Beavis, President of the Medical Association for Prevention of War, Francois Couillard, CEO of the Canadian Association of Medical Radiation Technologists and President of the Ottawa OCIS, Canada, and he's joining us by video conference. Dr. Peter Karamoskos, representing the Australian Conservation Foundation. He's a radiologist and nuclear medicine physicist, physician, at the Epworth Hospital in Melbourne. Professor Hassan Kat, nuclear medicine physician and cardiologist at the Cardiac Health Institute, and Associate Professor Geoff Currie, Charles University, co-founder and executive of the Rural Alliance in Nuclear Scintigraphy, so RAINS. So welcome again. I'm Associate Professor Lynn Angel, and I'm the non-expert moderator for the sessions today. So this session will focus on alternate production. We've heard this morning about the reactors, and now we're talking about alternate production methods for technetium-99. There's been question raised in the public arena about whether we need the ANSTO reactor at all, given cyclotrons have been used in Canada to produce technetium-99 directly. So the theme, to make sure we keep focus for this session, cyclotrons have been used in Canada. Why can't cyclotrons replace the reactor in Australia? Where is the science now and in the foreseeable future? What would be the model in Australia for cyclotron-based production? And where is Australia in the research market? I'll remind all of our panel members who are presenting that we have a tight 5-minute frame, and then it will allow, hopefully, questions from the viewers and more discussion around the panel. So to start this, I'm going to start with one of the key researchers in this alternative technology area, Associate Professor Geoff Currie. Thank you, Geoff.
Thanks, Lynn. I guess that I'm a logical place to start because I've actually been doing this research with my colleagues. I've just poked up a PowerPoint presentation just of a couple of the abstracts that have been on international conferences. A couple of them have been award-winning with colleagues from Portugal and Russia and Poland and a few other places, including Canada, on looking at the ways that we can actually produce technetium directly with cyclotrons. So I have some considerable expertise in where we're at with this current model. So those are the couple of the abstracts that are being done. So I guess that, and we can come back to the next PowerPoint in a second, some of the points that need to be made is that we've known that we can actually produce technetium-99M directly via cyclotrons since the 70s, as Peter said earlier. We don't do it, and there's a number of reasons why we don't do it. The same reason that we don't actually sell technetium-99M directly produced in a reactor is that you have a number of radiochemical impurity issues. The OECD report of 2010 indicated that, it's actually a promising technology, and that's why I'm doing research, and it is a promising technology. Will it ever, in the foreseeable future, replace reactors? The answer is absolutely not. The Canadian experience is evidence of that. There's a number of problems that we actually don't foresee and is not actually written into the 2010 report. Some simple things like the targetry is a highly enriched molybdenum 100 target. The only source of that is out of Russia. It's an unreliable source. You can't get it regularly, and the prices have been skyrocketing. And as a result of that, it contributes significantly to the cost of production, far exceeding the cost of molybdenum production in a reactor. And if we're going to talk about full cost recovery in cyclotrons would be 3 or 4 times higher than full cost recovery in a low enriched uranium reactor. There's other problems as well. Is that the experience with the Canadians, who are very optimistic, and their publications are out there. 6-hour bombardment. 350 gigabecs. By the time they do the radiochemical purity, because we end up with a number of radionuclide impurities in there, the TGA certainly wouldn't approve injection into humans in Australia of the current quality of product. That increases costs. And while you're doing that radiochemical purity, you've got a 6-hour half-life, so it's decaying. So that 350 gigabecs quickly degrades to about 120 gigabecs for export. There's people in this room who will be buying generators from ANSTO that will have generators in excess of 100 gigabecs generators. So the idea that kind of production at a high quality facility could supply even the Sydney basin is quite preposterous. So it supply 1, maybe 2 teaching hospitals in Sydney. So what that means is that you've got to create a network of cyclotrons. We can't use the cyclotrons that exist in Australia today because they don't have the energy capacity. They're designed for producing PET isotopes. So they're not capable of producing technetium directly. There's 3 that have the energy capacity, 16 MeV, and they're busy doing other things. So we'd have to create an entire new network. The redundancies that would need to be built into that would mean that small communities in rural Australia might actually end up with less reliable supply significantly less reliable supply than we currently have. You wouldn't have an after-hours service. You wouldn't be able to provide weekend emergency studies. And essentially create a 2-tiered healthcare system in Australia. So with my Rural Alliance hat on, it would be an absolute disaster from a rural perspective. The other problem is that we actually have a system with the existing reactor that if at programmed times when we're doing maintenance, we actually have alternative methods for shipment because molybdenum has a 67-hour half-life. When you're looking at technetium, if all of a sudden you've got a redundancy in, say, Wagga Wagga, then all of a sudden is that you can't just easily get an extra dose coming down being delivered by road from Sydney to cover that. So how do you actually cover those redundancies? And of course the manpower, at the moment it's centralised at ANSTO in Sydney, to actually have the manpower for 100 cyclotrons in a network across Australia where you've got physicists and chemists and technical people to run these facilities, and the daily road transport associated with that would be enormous. So it's an impractical solution, but at the moment the science is not there. It's very optimistic. It's a fantastic opportunity for us to be doing some research in that area, and I'm enjoying what I'm doing, but it's not even close to providing a commercial solution in Canada, let alone in Australia.
Geoff, thank you very much for those insights. I'd now like to ask Dr. Beavis from MAPW. I'm still getting my head around that acronym. If you'd like to state your response, please.
Okay, so once again we've got a false premise in that they're implying that cyclotrons will replace the reactor now. We're not saying that. We're saying look to the future, keep up with the science, keep up with the world leaders. The OECD said and that all supply chain participants should implement full cost recovery, including costs related to capital replacement. Well, for ANSTO, it says it's committed to the transparency. I haven't seen any reports. I've done a lot of Google searching around this. So I think it would be really good for ANSTO, if it's committed to transparency, to actually give us a full cost recovery model that includes building the reactor, that includes insurance, that includes decommissioning, that includes handling of the waste. Because once they can give us a transparent full cost recovery model, then we can start thinking about making them accountable. We are arguing that Australia should be partnering with Canada in taking advantage of the major advances that Canada has taken with the Triumph Consortium. I'd like to quote from Paul Schaefer in a talk he gave last year to the Canadian Nuclear Society, in which he said, many of the more than 950 medical cyclotrons around the world today operate between 16 and 24 MeV, which is the ideal range for production of 99 technetium. Since 2010, 5 institutions have been studying the parameters for producing 99 technetium on 3 different common cyclotron models. The team has now demonstrated reliable commercial-scale process for producing 99 technetium using molybdenum-100. And Geoff's point about the supply being unreliable and from Russia, well, once this process becomes commercialised, then other people will be interested in producing it. So I think once cyclotrons become more common, then there will be other reactors producing this molybdenum. I'll go back to Paul Schaefer. Our approach has been approved by Health Canada, and a clinical trial, which is routine for getting approvals in use in patients, is currently underway. He then went on to say that cyclotrons are capable of providing a stable, secure and reliable supply of life-saving diagnostic and therapeutic isotopes for years to come. There are isotopes that will require a reactor in the future. We just think there will need to be less reactors and therefore less nuclear waste. And Australia should be looking into this. Other countries are supportive and are interested. The UK, the US, lots of people have done reports and reviews. So I've just quote from this one, and I'm sorry to be doing so much reading, but it's good to have sources that are factual and authoritative. So this is the 2014 UK report. The model of cyclotron-based manufacture of 99 technetium from 100 molybdenum is one that's being developed and evaluated in Canada, and the production of commercial quantities has been shown to be feasible. When compared to other technical approaches, it is concluded that direct cyclotron production of 99 technetium is the most promising model for the UK. Compared to other approaches, cyclotron production is thought to be the most mature, and it also lends itself better to co-production with other radioisotopes, because there are lots of isotopes. Technetium is just the most commonly used for imaging, but it's important to have a range of isotopes available. It's worth noting that the Canadian cyclotron technology has been successfully commercialised late last year. I think, indeed, 10 other countries are joining with Canada to look at this research under an International Atomic Energy Agency project, and these countries include the US, Italy and Japan, and I question why Australia is not part of inquiring into the advancing science of this, because these are the world leaders. In early 2015, the Triumph Group made enough isotope for daily supply for British Columbia on a common brand of medical cyclotron. I'd like to correct some of Geoff's numbers. Australia has 11 cyclotrons that are suitable for making technetium. Cyclotrons, just for people that don't know about the size of a four-wheel drive car, cost about $2 million. How many do you need? Well, Canada is planning to have 24. Canada is 19% bigger geographically than Australia, so say 20% bigger for want of better numbers. It has 34.5 million people. Australia has 24 million people. And so we already have 11. Canada's planning to have 24. So I think it's not right to say that we're going to have to build a whole lot more. And for remote areas, clearly we would need more. Given there is a shorter half-life, you will need some to be in hospitals like Alice Springs and places like that. I'll just go to the Canadian government report, which came out when talking about cyclotrons, saying a more distributed network of supply hubs would eliminate the single point failure. In other words, that huge chunk that goes out if a reactor producing an enormous amount of isotopes goes down, that makes today's supply chain so vulnerable. An important consideration from a cost savings and an environmental perspective is that this option would largely avoid nuclear waste issues, and that's really why we're all here. Investment in the development of this option is low risk, because even if the technetium-99 production technology does not prove successful, or if demand for technetium-99 continues to drop, which it may well, the facilities would continue to be useful for other missions, namely producing positron emission tomography, in other words, PET medical isotopes. Another feature of the cyclotron approach is that it has the prospect of being economically viable without the need for ongoing government support, and I think that will be down the track once it's established as a competitive thing. So once again, I'm saying that MAPW is not saying that cyclotrons are ready to replace the reactor now, and I suspect when we have cyclotrons, there will still be reactors around the world that will need to supply certain isotopes. We are saying that they look to be cleaner and they look to be a much more reliable source of technetium. We need to be partnering with Canada and investigating opportunities for cyclotron use in Australia.
Thank you very much, Margaret. Now, Peter, if you'd like to spend 5 minutes of your time, please.
Thank you, Lynn. It's interesting reading the Canadian literature and then listening to Geoff. It's almost like Geoff has hopped on the wrong research wagon. because the Canadians clearly have a lot more faith in this technology. They've poured $35 million into research, and they've delivered outcomes that are just light years ahead of some of the features that Geoff has mentioned, and Margie has enumerated those. The issue of supply chain difficulties in Australia. We have to remember that Australia is a highly urbanised society. About 80 to 90% of our population lives within about a 4-hour drive of a capital city. So therefore, cyclotron production is feasible, and the issues in regional areas can be addressed. But these are not if and whether they will be addressed, it's a matter of how. And these are always challenges in the medical market. I mean, just a few months ago, for example, even in the city, we can have supply failures. When there was a police incident in front of the radio pharmacy that supplies our hospitals, and indeed supplies most of Melbourne. And most of Melbourne on a Friday didn't have any isotopes. And only one hospital, which gets generators, refused to give out any doses. I mean, this happens a lot of the time. There was a plane load of generators that went missing for 24 hours. It was meant to go to one capital city, ended up in Perth. And of course, all the customers of the supplier then were left without isotopes for that day. I mean, supply chain issues are inherent in a linear supply chain failures are inherent in a linear supply chain, which is what reactors put forward. Alternative mechanisms such as cyclotrons enable a distributed supply chain, where if one cyclotron goes out, another can kick in. Now, all cyclotrons above 16 MeV have a capability to be used to produce technetium. Now, naturally, some are better than others, and the higher energy, the better it is. And in fact, the UK has bought a 24 MeV 19 MeV TR24 cyclotron for SPECT and PET production recently. The issue is, are we committed? Are we going to make a policy of having a diversity of sources of technetium, because that's what the profession needs. Diversification of our sources to enable security of supply. And that's the real issue here. Cyclotrons might not be right for today, and Canada might have issues to address, and they do. But in Australia, we're not talking about flicking the switch tomorrow. We're talking about down the track. And it's essential that Australia take the lead in this area, and not purely rely on reactor-driven technology. Otherwise, it will be out-innovated. Now remember, as good as the Opal reactor is, it's not an innovative reactor. It's bought off the shelf from an Argentinian manufacturer using techniques that have long been established. This is not innovation. If you want innovation, you go to Canada.
That's a perfect segue, thank you, Peter, into our next speaker. I'd like to ask Francois, sitting again patiently, late afternoon in Canada, could you please share your insights with us? Thank you.
Thank you. I feel in a very awkward position here. You're all flattering Canada as being such a great source of innovation, and I'm about to maybe nuance a little bit your opinion here of Canada. So we have effectively in Canada some very, very interesting projects on the way using either cyclotron or, one thing hasn't been mentioned, linear accelerators. There's actually in the center of Canada, there's a group working on using linear accelerators instead of cyclotrons, which would provide a greater range, greater capacity even than the cyclotrons. I visited a few of these cyclotron facilities, the one in Quebec in Sherbrooke and the other one in Vancouver. The one in Vancouver got a lot of hype a few years ago at the annual meeting of the International Nuclear Medicine Society in the United States, where the keynote speaker was the researcher that did the work on this to produce molybdenum on the cyclotron. So he had his hour of glory. I saw him after I tried to talk to him after his talk, and people were lining up to speak to him and engage and have partnerships, people from all over the world. So lots of interest, really exciting. What they were able to do in Vancouver is they showed that in the course of one run, they were able to supply enough technetium to supply the city of Vancouver. It's not the size of Sydney, but it's still a fairly large city by Canadian standards. So it's truly amazing work. They've done fantastic research, fantastic development. However, none of these projects has yet demonstrated an ability to produce commercial quantities of product on an ongoing basis. Let's keep that clear. None of these projects is commercial yet. They're still in the development stage. Some of them have commercial partners, some don't. The commercial partners are not lining up to fund these projects in huge numbers. Why is it not there? Well, there's still a lot of unknowns, and as Geoff mentioned, one of the key ones is they rely to produce their target material. They rely on molybdenum 100, which is single source from Russia. So they're doing a lot of work right now to try to recycle this target material to reduce costs and reduce reliance on Russia. They're also looking for alternative sources of supply. So although I'm optimistic that eventually cyclotron-produced technetium will be part of the landscape, I have trust in the science, I have trust in the capacity of Canadians and other researchers around the world. It's not about to replace reactor-produced technetium anytime soon. It will complement the existing production, is my belief. A few years ago, a lot of these cyclotron projects used the announcement of the closure of the NRU reactor to claim that they would save the world. There was a lot of press releases by these researchers saying with a lot of confidence that in a few years they'd be up and running and working seamlessly to replace the NRU reactor and any other reactor in the world. In the last, if you read some of their statements over the past months, 6 months, a year, they're really toning down their claims and tending to be a lot more prudent. Now, some of you asked me to say a few words about why did Canada invest in cyclotrons and not reactors? Well, actually, Canada invested in reactors hugely. They invested in 2 new reactors that would have been dedicated to the supply of, solely dedicated to the supply of medical radioisotopes. And why 2? To have a full backup. So each one would have been able to produce the full supply for the world, and they would have had a backup. These were mothballed several years ago because they were not able to meet the regulatory requirement. I'm not a physicist, but there were a problem called something association to a negative power coefficient of something that they were never able to explain. So they've been mothballed. I don't know exactly for what reason then the government decided not to invest in another reactor, but I would suspect that they've been burnt and that it was too much of a political cost. So investing in smaller, innovative projects with cyclotrons seemed like a very good idea. Now, there are several other new technology projects around the world, notably in the United States. For example, Nordion, the Canadian processor, is working with the MURR reactor in Missouri on a new reactor technology. Now, Nordion is very capable. They're smart people. They're putting their bet in reactor technology. And they claim that they'll be producing regularly by 2018. So, again, none of these new technologies has achieved any scale yet, so they cannot participate for a little while in the global supply chain. What I'd like to remind you is that it's very difficult to differentiate hype from facts in all of these projects. A lot of these are looking for secure sources of funding to support their ongoing development costs, especially the American projects. And they have to look good. They have to look good in the media. They have to look good in anything they publish if they're going to continue to get money from their funders. So they do fantastic work, but fantastic work, research work, development work does not equate to commercial success. I know. I've run operations for the largest supplier. I know how difficult it is to get in there. There's technical challenges. There's financial funding, there's heavy pharmaceutical and radiation protection regulatory burden, there's transportation and logistic challenges, and once you've resolved all these challenges, then you've got competitors that will undercut you in prices and customer service to keep you out of the market. So it's very, very difficult for any new entrants to come into this. All that being said, Australia is very well positioned with existing facilities, know-how, recent reliable and safe reactor, an established customer base, and a solid international network. Now, what will the future look like? If I had a crystal ball, I would say it will be a hybrid. There will still be reactors, and there will be new technologies. So there will be small producers using cyclotrons, linear accelerators, and there will still be the large global supply chain for reactors. I think there's a place for both. And we need to be flexible. We don't need to argue one over the other. You happen to have this incredible source of production, capitalize on that, but at the same time, start looking at future sources. That's very smart for the future. But you have something that is the envy of the whole world. Don't throw that out.
Thank you,
Sorry for the long...
No, that's been very helpful, actually. Thank you very much, Francois. Now I'm going to ask Dale if you can have your claim.
Thanks, Lynn. I'm a physicist, so I thought I'd just start with a little physics for the viewing audience. Reactors make molybdenum-99. That decays with a half-life of 67 hours. It decays to technetium, which is what we use in the diagnostic studies. Technetium's got a half-life of 6 hours. So with a 67-hour half-life for molybdenum, that can be shipped to a hospital once a week, and that can be then extracted, have the technetium extracted from it as required. So it's highly desirable to put the source of the technetium generation into the hospital department, so that if the person comes into the emergency department with chest pain at 3 a.m. and needs a lung scan, the on-call team can provide it. Same thing on the weekend, and we offer a full 24/7 service in our hospital. So if you move to a different model where you make technetium at a cyclotron somewhere and then transport it, you wouldn't be able to do that at 3 o'clock in the morning. You probably wouldn't do it on the weekend. You would have to be transporting enormous amounts of technetium by road, using vehicles, pollution, and dealing with Sydney traffic and all the other problems that we have. And it just becomes an impractical thing to move that much technetium around. Geoff represents the regional parts of Australia, where, although Peter, as rightly points out, we cling to the coastlines and live in metropolitan areas, there's still a very large number of nuclear medicine practices in the regions. We have something like 250 different facilities in Australia, and they are scattered well and truly throughout the countryside. And if you think about, say, Orange, Dubbo, if we were supplying with cyclotrons from Sydney, you've got the considerable time of transfer from the original site to the diagnostic facility, and that would mean there'd be decay along the way, that you're then losing radioactivity all the time. So really, it doesn't make any sense to transport technetium. Unless you're making it in your backyard and you can make it at 3 o'clock in the morning, you're much better to have the generator sitting there that can just be eluted, where you just pass saline through it, and out the bottom we get the diagnostic agent. So it's a much better model. Now, also, nuclear medicine is really very naive about the source of where we get our isotopes from. If a technology came along which was clearly superior to a reactor produced, and there are issues with reactors, of course, that everyone talks about, that's what we know. But if there was a demonstrably superior technology, nuclear medicine would be all for that. We don't mind where it comes from as long as we've got the juice to supply the patients.
Thank you very much, Dale. And Adi, your comments, please.
Thank you very much. I never ever expected in my life to be with my fellow community of people who are against war and against the proliferation of nuclear technologies, and hear somebody say that they want the market to control the supply of molybdenum-100. Molybdenum-100 is a stable isotope. 9.83% of molybdenum is molybdenum-100. But how does Russia make it? They use the same technology that is used to enrich uranium, to enrich molybdenum-100. So I've just heard for the first time somebody think that the market is going to develop various technologies, be they gas technologies or centrifuge technologies or other technologies, to enrich materials and make this generally available to the world so that you can have a reliable supply of medical isotopes, while at the same time criticising reactors which are low-enriched uranium for being part of an apparent concern about nuclear warfare. It's shocking. Basically, molybdenum 100 has been produced in exactly the same sorts of facilities as enriched uranium in order for those countries to understand the properties of those materials. So as much as I like the elegance of the work that is being done on that, there's a reason that the supply chain is very weak. And it's only nuclear weapon states that have this type of enrichment technology, which is not under the control of safeguards, that they can produce these materials. And so I think we should think really, really carefully before we rapidly go into enriched materials of this type in order to produce nuclear medicines. Having said that, the experimentation is elegant and the chemistry has advanced a lot. And the potential for use is actually quite exciting for small island states if you can have a safeguarded approach to the production of the enriched isotope. If you're a small island state, you're not going to easily get reactor-based supply. They're putting those supply chains in, getting the airlines to agree, get everybody to agree, that stuff is really difficult. But if we could have a safeguarded approach to small island states, for example, or remote countries, to have this type of technology available to them, I'd be extremely comfortable to say that ANSTO would be right at the front of that charge. Why don't we look at this technology? We do. As I've indicated, ANSTO operates the largest accelerator in Australia, the Australian synchrotron. It's an electron accelerator. That means we know a lot about the photon techniques that could be used to make MO99. We run 3 cyclotrons, so that means that we know about the energy range for the cyclotrons that can be used. By the way, as the energy goes up from the physics, the growing in of other forms of technetium, which you don't want in, is actually a very serious problem, which means that the production times for these particular cyclotrons are going to remain high, I think. So I really do think we need to reflect. When you're promoting solutions, we need to look at the whole supply chain. And I think there's a dangerous presupposition that the market can supply low-cost MO 100 in order to supply this market. And I hope there's some reflection on that and some internal questioning of whether we're just really criticizing an existing set of technologies, but not really embracing the consequences of the ones that we're talking about. Having said that, I do hope that some of the photon techniques that Francois talked about, some of the other technologies with the linear accelerators also look promising to me. I think there's a reasonable expectation that in densely populated urban environments, within 20 years or so, we'll have reliable supply out of accelerators. And I think that'll be a great thing. It'll provide an alternative, it'll provide redundancy and so on. But there's no plausible scenario where these accelerator-based techniques should replace existing established capacity. Because basically, if you do the math for Australia, just to supply our network on a reasonable basis with the known costs at the moment, you would have the cost of an opal reactor with all of the other overheads just for the nuclear medicine. And the case that I think we're trying to make is the opal reactor, this is one of the missions. The many other missions help pay for that resource and to make it economic. There's no economic case for accelerator-based production in the short term. However, I think for communities and countries that don't have that capacity, where they're isolated from the reactor provision, we should be working hard in the consortia that are developing internationally to do it. But I would not be a proponent of a market solution to molybdenum 100 production just being left to the vagaries of the market. I think that would be a dangerous thing.
Thank you, Addy. Now, that has actually finished the more formal presentations from the panel, and we've now got some opportunity for other panel members to join into the discussion. Peter, if you've just got a comment first.
Yes, picking up from what Addy mentioned, Addy said that he wouldn't believe in a market solution to cyclotron production of isotopes, but I thought it was all about cost recovery and making sure that we've got financial sustainability. So I just put that question out there. But with regards to the molybdenum 100 that comes from Russia, now, firstly, there's not enough volume of molybdenum to really pose a proliferation danger in Russia. Furthermore, LEU is not necessarily proliferation resistant. I'm not suggesting the 5% enrichment level. I'm suggesting the infrastructure that goes to providing LEU. It's not long ago that Iran produced a research reactor for which it said it was going to produce isotopes that was 19.75% enriched, still LEU, for isotope production, and it almost came to war. So really, you can't divorce your reactor from the infrastructure that enriches the uranium. So that's two things. So can I just finish?
Yep.
So I just want to mollify your concern. The other thing is, it seems surprising that 80 would condemn Russia as a proliferation threat, yet at the same time, several years ago, Australia was prepared to ship its uranium to Russia to fuel its reactors. Now, it stopped doing that, not because they were concerned about proliferation dangers, but because it was part of the sanctions against Russia for invading Ukraine. So let's not be too morally outraged here and create this sort of confected sense of outrage. I think that needs to be put into context.
Thanks, Peter. Eddie.
To be absolutely clear, I did not say that I didn't think the economics of cyclotrons would work. I'm making a particular narrow point. The technology that is used to enrich uranium for positive benefit to society and nuclear medicine can be used badly, as we all know. That's a consensus. It's been an Australian consensus. What I think the public needs to know is that molybdenum 100 would be made using those techniques. And the statement was made that the market will sort out the production of molybdenum 100, but the techniques used are the techniques that we don't want people to get out into the general domain. So the market can't solve that.
Thank you, Eddie. Now, Peter, I'm just now going to turn to Barry.
Look, I'd like to make a couple of points. First of all, I don't think there's any doubt that we should encourage cyclotron research for production, and we're way down, we're far away from that. I think it's very important that our listeners and viewers understand that we may have 11 cyclotrons in this country, but there's probably only one, maybe two, that might be able to do something. Please, let's not get silly about it. Our local hospitals wouldn't even talk to the person next to it, never mind use their cyclotron for research. So let's just put that away. It's absolute nonsense. I don't care how many cyclotrons we have. If they're owned by a hospital, they belong to a hospital, and they will not be used in that process. So let's not, let's be silly about, not be silly about that. We don't have enough cyclotrons. We don't have enough voltage. And I think the other thing, I've spent a lot of time working in remote centres. I'll quote Dubbo, Port Macquarie, and when I first started in Wollongong was almost a remote centre. You cannot provide services in remote centres with unless you have a cyclotron there. It ain't going to happen. Let's be absolutely realistic. Rather, let's say we need regular, reliable supply from a reactor for our remote population, and they should not be treated any differently from those that choose to live on the sea. Thank you.
Thank you, Barry. Hassan, did you have a comment to someone who hasn't been involved with the formal part of it at this point?
Well, I thought I tend to agree with Barry that transparency across healthcare, both in public and private, is absent or virtually absent, and there's really no point to focus on one aspect of healthcare in Australia. There is no accountability of how viable a Department of Cardiology at Royal North Shore is versus Westmead. None. There's no comparisons between how effective private cardiology compared to public cardiology service. None. So why would we need to even focus on just one $140 million shortfall when the whole Medicare public system is probably in billions of dollars? And there's no comparisons. So as a clinician and academic, incidentally, I also know that such transparency doesn't exist in universities either. And universities certainly are heavily federally funded and subsidized. Where is the transparencies of how good the money have been used? I think that's the main crux from the first discussion that I like to contribute, because I have that input into the clinical aspect and academic aspect. As far as the isotope is concerned, modalities are generally complementary. They are not ubiquitous for certain diagnoses. If you're a patient with only a fifth of your heart function working. You want every comparable and complementary facilities to double check, triple check that the subsequent treatment is truly the viable treatment. And therefore, it is not one technique versus the other. It is really the complementary aspect of the technique. As far as the bread and butter tests, technetium certainly is brilliant. For $200, I will know whether I can operate, if I were a urologist, on a prostate, or whether I should treat the patient with a bone scan. That's it. It's so simple. No other test can override that as a bread and butter. Myocardial perfusion imaging with technetium is the most evidence-based viability and prognosis proven modality. No other test has superseded that. And it's bread and butter. So for all these reasons, I think these modalities will continue to exist because they have different weighting in different aspects of diagnosis and treatment.
And if I can just comment from the patient's perspective, I'd certainly want to know that, provided all the risks and benefits have been looked at carefully, patient by patient, that I was going to get the best, or for any of my family that was available at the time, given that we need to really continue to keep researching, to keep seeking what the best might look like. So I'd like to, Dale first and then Margaret. Thank you, Dale.
ANSTO were involved in bringing the first medical cyclotron into Australia, a 30 MeV machine, I believe, installed in Sydney. And after it used up its useful life, it was decommissioned. What happens to a cyclotron when it reaches end of life? Where is it now? Where's that cyclotron?
So there are parts of the cyclotron which can be retained for intellectual property reasons. There was a lot of development of targets in Australia, and very, very clever and effective targets. So we've retained all of that intellectual property, and we retain that targetry. I'm hoping that as cyclotron applications become cheaper, that we might be able to reintroduce that. Second thing is you get the what we'd call the cold parts, the parts that you simply decide to either sell off as scrap or take parts of it in some cases and move them into other facilities. And then finally, cyclotrons get activated during the course of their life. That activation is what we'd call a short to medium term waste problem. It gradually decays away. And during that time, we store the cyclotron as we store the other nuclear waste that we have in secure facilities, and we monitor that decay until it's fully decayed away. And then there is typically some contamination issues as well, so we have to monitor for that contamination. So it's treated, it starts off as an intermediate level waste, just as our liquid wastes do when they come out of the production of MO99. And then it gradually decays down to low, and then eventually is able to be disposed of as a non-nuclear waste. Very similarly, the waste that we've brought back from France, we've managed to secure an agreement that they give us the 300-year waste, not the 100,000-year waste. So that was a very good negotiation on our part to minimise the risk to the country over the long term. So the cyclotrons also have some challenges in terms of what modalities you're using and which particular isotopes you're using, because the patients themselves become reactive for a period of time, whether it's reactor-based or so on. And so what we are trying to do in Australia with all of the isotopes we select, both for our cyclotrons and for our reactors, is look for the ones that have co-products at the absolute minimum level. Now, one of the worries that I have with technetium produced in cyclotrons, the higher the energy you use, the more technetium that is not technetium-99M, but other forms of technetium that is there. Because the enriched Moly-100, which we've been talking about, is not enriched to a very, very high. It's just above 98%. So 2% of the material is actually longer-lived isotopes. We're not quite sure where that goes in the body. So really what we want to do is think from the patient perspective, think from the rational economics perspective, but overall from a waste perspective, the total volume of waste over the lifetime of the reactor is something that's quite difficult to understand. If I bring it back to the patient, For every technetium-99 M dose that goes into a patient, diagnosis, saves their life, there's about half a teaspoon of waste. I think that half teaspoon of waste is worth it.
But the cyclotrons themselves are a radioactive waste problem as well.
And,
not a disposal problem.
And once you're transporting as well, if you take transport, production, use in the facilities, I think you would have a significant increase in the overall what I call system risk if you had a large number of cyclotrons.
Yeah.
Thanks, Addy. Margaret.
I think the numbers that I understand are that there were 9 in 2013 that had sufficient power to generate work to be converted to produce technetium, and my latest update was that there are 11. At 2 million per cyclotron, once the technology is proven, I think they could go into some of the more regional areas, and that wouldn't be a problem because 2 million in terms to a regional hospital is quite a feasible thing to do, especially if we're spending $140 million a year subsidising the reactor currently. Also, as I've said earlier, most countries in the world import their isotopes. If there are remote areas that need isotopes, we can continue to import them from other countries. The question that's underpinning this entire webinar is the nuclear waste problem that Australia has and what we're going to do about it. And we're trying to say we need an inquiry to say that we need to work out about what is the best for future waste management production, and then also about how we're going to manage our waste. So I think they're important issues. In terms of the, it's a false argument to say it's either or. We can have cyclotrons in Australia and still import technetium as we need to for remote areas.
Thank you, Margaret. Geoff,
On the $2 million.
Yeah, that's totally wrong.
The $2 million is the core cost of the machine. The best way to estimate the cost of a cyclotron facility is to take the energy. If it's 16 MeV, the facility will cost about $16 million. If it's 24 MeV, it'll cost about $24 million. So to suggest that the core cost of the asset is the full cost of a cyclotron facility is simply wrong.
That's not correct, Adrian.
That's not correct.
Pet trace is $2 million. I got that directly from GE. Yes, there are facility costs on top of that. If you want to go to the...
Peter, that's totally wrong.
That's rubbish.
$5 million.
You know, every hot cell that you put in for processing is a minimum of about $300,000.
No, I
mean, you couldn't get out of a facility install on a greenfield site for less than about $6 million.
Oh, well, that's not
with
16,
a pet trace.
that's not
I mean,
16
that's a
million.
small one. That's a pet trace. It's much smaller.
That's what we're talking about.
Well, no, that's
$16 million.
No, you can't. You've got to have 16 MEVs to produce cyclotrons.
Pet trace is 16.5 MeV.
Okay, then it's going to cost you 16 million.
Why 16 million?
Because of the
You
hot
just said 6
cells,
million.
the build. I didn't say 6. I'm saying
You need
16.
metre-thick concrete around it.
It doesn't cost 16 million.
No.
A metre thick
does.
concrete doesn't cost 16
We actually
million.
have quite an extensive group of
course it does.
expertise that have actually built these facilities.
yeah.
You're not going to get the capital for $2 million.
You're being
and
done.
the other issue is that when you say that there's 11 cyclotrons, there may be 11 cyclotrons in Australia, but all these cyclotrons are built for pets. There are 8.
Yeah, they'll need conversion.
No, they can't be converted. They can't be converted.
Well, the Canadians are talking about converting.
No, they
The Canadians are producing this using the pet trace cyclotron.
Pet trace is 16 MeV, and so we have 3 cyclotrons in Australia of 16 MeV. The one at ANSTO at Camperdown, the one at Macquarie University, and there's one in Adelaide. And they're the only 3 that are capable of producing technetium. And so to come back to
800 series.
So to come back to the science of it is that because you criticise me being on the wrong bandwagon for the research. This is the actual research that's actually productive. The Canadians on the wrong side of the equation. All of that science that I quoted that you felt that I was on the wrong band, that's actually from the Canadian experience. It's published. It's published in the Journal of Nuclear Medicine, the most prestigious of our journals. Those barriers and limitations come from irradiating with 24 MeV. If you come back to 16 MeV, that's where, as Addy said, you end up with less contaminants in the process. You end up with less output, but it's actually a cheaper production process because you don't actually have the purification process. So when you actually say higher energy, it is true. And so you actually said higher energy is better at it. It's not. It shows a lack of understanding of the actual science around cyclotron production. If the purpose of this is to actually get an expert panel of people together to actually inform the public about what the real science is, then we need to be speaking about the science we understand.
But Geoff,
and that
you're not
clearly
correct.
indicates that the science is not right.
You're not correct. You're not correct. Read the papers. I
have
can
read
show
the
you.
papers.
No, you haven't. No, you clearly haven't.
clearly
I
happened.
think it's fair to say that you're a publishing scientist in the field.
That's exactly right.
I thought
Well, you know,
Actually, I'm
I've
going to
seen your name
interrupt
about 8th on
Peter.
the list there. Jeff, how much of it actually?
That's not
Peter,
fair.
I'm going to
No, that's
interrupt
not
this,
fair.
and we do have a
Read his
question
paper.
from the viewers. Dave Sweeney actually asked a question for Addy. Okay, so did the Australian community and the full range of stakeholders get to make comment on ANSTO's plan to greatly increase isotope production? In short, who said yes, when, and after what process?
And just for clarity, Dave Sweeney is the
Thank you.
NDU for Australian Conservation Foundation.
Thank you.
And Peter's here representing him.
Thank you. Addy?
I think it's an excellent question. The process of deciding that we would have a replacement research reactor ran from the latter part of the 90s. It was approved in the early 2000s. The reactor was constructed and began operating in 2006. Throughout that period, it was envisaged that Australia would continue to play the domestic supply role and would look to potentially increase that into a global supply chain. It was very much part of the discussion. When I joined ANSTO in 2009, we had a project at the time which was called the Mega Moly project. It was already on the cards. It had been widely discussed with our stakeholders in the board and with the ministers at the time. And so the expansion of this facility was absolutely consistent with the mirror image we had in Canada, in the Netherlands, in Belgium, where these countries, which you can in some senses see as periphery countries, they're not the biggest of the countries, have taken on the burden of developing these sorts of technologies. It's really interesting to me that cyclotron technologies have mainly developed in these peripheral countries, in Belgium, in Sweden, in Canada. So this seems to be a particular niche that countries of our size and with our strategic intent to be a global player in nuclear medicine, that's no different to somebody developing a drug in Melbourne around diabetes or something else, wanting it to be a global drug, not just an Australian drug.
Thank you for that. And we do have another question. Cameron asks, what is the comparative level of waste from cyclotron production per unit activity versus reactor production? And perhaps either Addy or Geoff might be able to respond to that.
It's quite a complex question to answer because the apportionment of the different parts of the cycle are important. I, for example, if we were to take molybdenum 100, I don't know what the waste streams for that look like because they haven't been quantified. But I think that it would be fair to say that the cost of waste in a nuclear medicine production facility that is reactor-based is going to be higher than the cost of production and of the waste component of a cyclotron facility. That's simply not even really discussable. The real issue is how much does the whole life cycle cost? And reactor-produced molybdenum-99 is the cheapest isotope by a factor of 5 to 10 of any diagnostic isotope that is available anywhere in the world. And the waste cost is a very small proportion of the total cost of the isotope. So I would argue that any replacement technology should be evaluated on the full cost recovery basis, and I think that's the rational economic basis of doing it.
I think the question was talking about the volumes of waste, not the cost.
Oh, the volumes are tiny. I think when we say waste, people think often of things like landfill sites and so on. You're talking about, if you think of a really big Bunnings store, Australia's nuclear waste site for nuclear medicine production will be significantly smaller than your average large Bunnings store. That's just a feel for what the waste will be over the next 40 years.
And that's a good perspective.
Yeah.
Look, I didn't think we'd actually use all of the time constructively, but thank you so much, we have. So I'd like to try and summarise and then get some consensus around a few points before we break for our next session. So clearly, cyclotron production for technetium is not a new technology. It can be done, but it does seem very clear that nationally and internationally there are still some major challenges around that in terms of the quality, the efficiency, the cost, and quite significant challenges remain. So while there are obviously benefits to the cyclotron production, it's not ready for commercialisation at a national level at this stage. So there are three areas I'm going to try and get consensus on. Cyclotron production of technetium-99 can't at this time or in the foreseeable future, so we're not talking about 15, 20, 50 years ahead, replace reactor production in terms of costs, efficiency, reliability or flexibility. Is there general consensus from the panel around that point?
If you take out the foreseeable future, yes.
Well, I'm not talking about...
It has to be
We're saying we agree, you can't do it
5 to
now?
10 years.
I think you need to cross out the foreseeable future.
And put a time on, you mean?
Well, there needs to be
years?
a time limit.
And there needs to be a policy. If that's whatever we want, if we want reactor production uniquely, then that's a policy decision that will come
Yeah, I
to
think
fruition.
that probably would be a given, but we are trying to talk about the science and what we are faced with at the moment.
Policy
The
determines
calibration
science.
point would be...
Well, not necessarily.
Absolutely.
That's a different discussion, I might add.
It doesn't because
Okay,
if
hang on.
you policy...
Let's go back to basics.
Is everyone happy with 10 years?
Let's go back to
No,
basics.
absolutely not. It's like Kodak and the camera. It's a matter of this technology will go ahead. The speed at which it will go ahead, we have to wait and see. But it's coming. So I think it's a matter of...
Oh, no, hang on. No. There's no consensus that's coming. No, there's no consensus that's coming.
But it is
Absolutely.
And in fact,
Where?
is that there may be other technologies
Where's it
like
coming?
linear accelerators
it
that
will
actually
come.
It's
surpass
being
the
researched.
cyclotron.
If something is being
you read the research?
So what we're
if you're researching something, you're researching something. You can't say because you're researching something, the outcome will be X, Y, and Z. The results of the research will inform what we're going to do.
It's been commercialised,
that
it's
we're
been
gonna
authorised
do
by
it is
health, it's
rubbish.
doing clinical trials.
Can I be very clear about research, and this I do know about? If you are working to research for an outcome that has already been planned, it would be very faulty research. So I think we need to keep that very, very clear in our
Research will
minds.
How are
inform.
research funds directed then?
Well,
Not through policy.
I'm not talking about
Research will inform
policy
policy
here now. I'm talking about good research. So in terms of
Word is
the
research.
agreement about it not being here for the foreseeable future, whether it be 1, 2, 3 or 5 years, I think probably that would be a reasonable statement to
I think
make.
that's fair. I think
In
also,
Australia, you're
and
talking
think
about?
what I've said very clearly is that there are exciting dimensions of this technology and there will be applicable markets.
Yes.
There's no doubt about that.
Question.
But there's some really big questions as well.
Yeah.
So
You're
the
saying
second...
Australia, Lynn? You're talking about Australia?
Well, I guess our situation, I think probably globally, but particularly Australia, let's focus on the Australian context. The second point that I wanted to put out there was that cyclotrons can't produce a solution for the other radionuclides produced in the reactor.
Yeah,
Well, we have
that's
said clearly
consensus,
that you can have cyclotrons and, like most of the world, import as need be some...
there's many that can't be imported.
But in terms of
well-
the production of, let's forget about the import-export discussion at this point.
I think that's a really important part of it.
We're talking about whether or not they're going to be able to replace all the things that reactors
Well,
currently do.
that wasn't a discussion. There's a paper by the American Association of Physicists in Medicine that shows how you can. Whether it's economic or not is another
Remains to be seen.
question, but you can.
Yeah, well, a lot of this has...
I think what we
run
can
back.
agree is that iodine 131 would become really difficult. And I think that lutetium-177 would be, in its modern form,
Yes.
its high specific activity form would be essentially impossible for Australia.
Again, we could import it.
No.
That's the point, you can't.
We can't do it now, and we won't do
Volume's
it
not high
then.
enough globally.
Yeah.
That's why we're trying to lead the world in lutetium-177 for the treatment of cancers, and why shouldn't we try to lead the world?
Yeah.
And that's the point.
that's a policy
ANSTO
choice.
a significant part of the health and well-being of every Australian.
Well, no, you've overstated that case many times, Geoff. I won't go to the wire with you on that, but that's been overstated a lot.
So the third point that I'm going to put out there for consensus, cyclotrons are a technology that as leaders globally in nuclear science, Australia should be investing in research efforts in the technetium-99 production. And I would put too that there could well be some serious discussion around potential partnership with industry and a university such as CSU, who does actually have the one of the national leaders in this research, and the department seems a logical next step. So the suggestion or the consensus around continuing that research at the same time to explore whether there may be better technologies, but alongside of what's happening in the reactor.
Yeah, I think that we would broaden from cyclotrons, though. We'd have to say accelerator-based.
Other technologies.
I think exploring Australia, if you could
consensus.
adjust that to accelerators,
Okay.
and possibly the suggestion of the partnership, leave that open to the best researchers in the country.
All right. Look, thank you so much for your contribution. We're going to close this and have a 10-minute break, and we'll be reconvening, in 10 minutes. So I'll see you all in about 11:10. Thank you very much.